Yeah, thank you so much. I will try to give an analysis in terms of the regional balance, in terms of these cabinet appointments, and the constitutional question of political inclusion in Uganda. This is a fundamental aspect, especially now that we have just seen the appointment of several ministers in light of the presidential mandate. But listen, for starters, it is important to understand that Uganda's latest cabinet appointments have actually once again revived one of the country's most sensitive and even enduring constitutional questions. Does political power in Uganda genuinely reflect national inclusion, or has the architecture of appointment gradually become concentrated around political loyalty and even regime preservation? That, my friend, becomes substantive food for thought. Listen, at the center of this debate, it's not merely about who has actually been appointed, but what the appointments symbolically communicate to the population about belonging, in terms of trust, for example, in terms of access to state power, and in terms of the future national cohesion, for example. Those are fundamentals in terms of that. Listen, the Constitution of Uganda, particularly under the national objectives and directive principles of state policy, emphasize inclusiveness, national unity, and balanced development. Now, the spirit behind constitutional governance was never simply about legality in terms of appointment. It was about ensuring that the state psychologically appears national in character. Because in deeply plural societies like Uganda, perception itself becomes a political reality. And that, my friend, is extremely important. Also, when citizens, for example, from a particular region repeatedly feel underrepresented in terms of key ministries, for example, or in terms of security structures, or in terms of finance portfolios, or even strategic decision-making spaces, the debate ceases to be administrative. It becomes existential. People begin asking whether political citizenship is equal in practice or merely equal in constitutional theory. Now, it is important, my friends, to make one thing very clearly. Constitutionally, the president retains broad discretion in terms of appointing the minister under Article 113. The appointing authority is legally empowered to select individuals he believes can implement government policy. So strictly speaking, cabinet formation is not about unconstitutional, merely because one region appears numerically dominant. However, legality alone is not sufficient for democratic legitimacy. Okay? And also, a government may satisfy the black letter law and still fail the broader test of national confidence in terms of political fairness and even in terms of emotional inclusion. Okay, and this is where the current national conversation becomes extremely, extremely important. It becomes extremely important for our viewers. Now, there is now a growing discourse around whether Uganda should actually consider a more structured legal, even constitutional instrument to guide political appointments in a manner that guarantees reasonable regional balance. And in terms of ethnic inclusivity, in terms of gender representation, and in terms of national participation in governance. Yes? Now, this is not a uniquely Ugandan debate. No, far from that. Countries emerging from, for example, historical divisions have often adopted constitutional balancing mechanisms to avoid perceptions of state capture. For example, Nigeria institutionalized what is called the federal character principle, designed to ensure public institutions in terms of reflecting the diversity of the federation. Kenya, our neighbor here, has constitutionally, provisions that emphasizing ethnic and even regional inclusivity in terms of public appointments after periods of severe political tensions. So, listen, the rationale is simple. In fragmented societies, inclusion is not charity. It is national stability policy. But there is also a serious counter-argument that must be acknowledged intelligently in terms of this particular discussion that we're having this evening. Listen, critics of rigid regional quotas argue that excessive legal restrictions on appointments may actually weaken executive efficiency. It may even dilute meritocracy and even constitutionalize tribal arithmetics. So they argue that the president must actually retain flexibility to appoint trusted or even competent, ideologically aligned individuals capable of implementing a national agenda. And this is where the debate becomes philosophically difficult. And this has become extremely important for all our viewers. Because, listen, Uganda is now balancing two competing constitutional ideas or ideals for that purpose. The need for presidential discretion and political functionality. You must be able to comprehend that. The need for presidential discretion and then political functionality. The need is for visible national inclusiveness and equitable state representation. Also fundamental becomes a question of debate in terms of what is happening in our good country called Uganda. Now, the deeper concern, my friends, for many Ugandans are expressing today is not merely tribal balancing in the narrow sense. It is the fear of political exclusion becoming institutionalized over time. So once citizens begin to feel that access to state power is geographically predictable, confidence in national institutions gradually weakens. History across Africa repeatedly shows that perceived exclusion is politically combustible, and that is something you have to understand from the word go. Therefore, perhaps the conversation Uganda must begin having is not necessarily about rigid ethnic quotas, but about developing transparent constitutional principles that encourage broad-based national representations while preserving competence and executive functionality. Because, my friends, ultimately, cabinet appointments are not just administrative decisions. Far from that, they are political signals. And that is something also fundamentally important. They actually communicate who belongs, who matters, who is trusted. And increasingly in modern African governance, they determine whether citizens see state as national institution or as an instrument orbiting around a narrow political center. So this is the real constitutional and political question Uganda is now confronting. So let us understand that particular point. Thank you once again for giving me the opportunity. God bless you. Thank you very much.